When you saw Frankenstein's monster, okay, he was a creature, he was undead, if you will, but you saw that there was goodness in the creature. He just wanted to be loved. And which of us does not want to find love and be accepted? And I think that's what really made the Karloff Frankenstein monster something special that no one else was ever able to duplicate.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, most people are fans of something, but very few turn that fandom into over 50 years of writing, collecting, archiving, and making friends.
We're honored to talk with Steve Vertlieb, an award-winning writer, film historian, critic, archivist, and poet who's been writing about motion pictures and symphonic film music since 1969. Many of his articles can be found online at the long-running science fiction fanzine File 770. Steve, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Well, thank you. I never considered myself particularly amusing, but I appreciate the invitation.
You became a cinephile at a very young age. Could you tell us about that?
In those days, they really couldn't afford to put major programming on. TV was still an exciting experiment, and so they put on public domain films from the 1930s. So even though it was 1950 and on, I kind of felt as though I was born in the 1930s because that's the entertainment that I was weaned upon. I found an early interest in science fiction, fantasy, and horror, although I don't like the word horror. I hate blood and gore, but I love the subtlety of the early universal horror films of the 30s with Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney. But I just found myself enveloped by this magical world. And then, of course, came Walt Disney and the Mickey Mouse Club, and I was an early member of that. So it was just a whole escape for me, a magical world that opened up where I could literally jump into the screen and participate and be part of that imagery.
So you were watching on television serials of Buck Rogers and that sort of thing?
Shall I lay our course directly for Saturn now, Buck?
May as well. Hey, Buck, look.
I grew up with Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, and Hopalong Cassidy was new to television. So these are my heroes. In later years, I became a good friend of Bus the Crab, which was, as a big kid, just so exciting for me. One of the greatest joys, if not the greatest joy of my life, which I told you when we had brunch, was the fact that most of my lifelong heroes became actual friends later in life. It was a period, right now, if you try to contact a movie star or a TV star, you've got to go through 100 agents and publicists, and even then it's doubtful that you'll contact anyone. But this was a more innocent time where a lot of these folks were trying to make a buck, remain relevant. They were on early TV and do the convention circuit. So it was relatively uncomplicated and often easy to meet them. And we just bonded, and that remains the greatest joy of my life.
Yeah, I wonder if you can share maybe a list of your most amazing pals that you met along the way.
I corresponded with my idol, Frank Sinatra, corresponded with British actor Peter Cushing. Funny story about Peter Cushing, in that in 1939, he had a very small part in the film A Chump at Oxford, which was a Laurel and Hardy film. And I used to, in those days when I wrote to people, I wanted my brother to be included if there was any response. So I signed all of my letters Steve and Erwin Vertlieb. So in New York in 1975, Peter appeared at a famous Monsters film convention, and I saw him coming out of the elevator, and I said, "Mr. Cushing, we used to correspond." And he said, "Oh, really? What's your name?" And I said, "Steve Vertlieb." And he said, "Oh, yes, you used to write to me with your brother, just like Laurel and Hardy." He was adorable. Corresponded a bit with John Wayne, had a correspondence with Alfred Hitchcock. These are people that I in later years wrote articles about. Sinatra has been my idol for 65 years. I wrote perhaps the longest article that I ever wrote about anyone for what would have been his 100th birthday in 2015, Sinatra All the Way. And it's damn near a book. It's huge. It took me months to write and compile rare posters and photographs, but I'm very proud of that. Who else? I knew Miklos Rozsa, the three-time Oscar-winning composer who won an Oscar for scoring Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston, which is perhaps the greatest film score ever written. Back in the 1950s, my mom loved classical music, and she always had on WFLN radio here in Philadelphia, and periodically they would play the Spellbound Concerto, which was written by Rozsa for Spellbound with Gregory Peck and Ingrid Bergman, and I fell in love with that. When I began writing professionally in the late 1960s and early 70s, Rozsa was premiering his piano concerto with Leonard Pinario at the piano and as the guest of Eugene Ormandy with the Philadelphia Orchestra at the Academy of Music. So being a little cocky at this point, having been published, I contacted the Academy and asked if I might come and meet Dr. Rozsa. So they invited me backstage after the concert, and Eugene Ormandy lived at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel on Broad Street in Philadelphia, and can remember Irwin, and this would have been 1968. Eugene Ormandy was walking ahead on Broad Street with Leonard Pinario, and slightly behind them were Irwin and I surrounding Miklos Rozsa. And every now and again, Eugene Ormandy would turn around concerned, making sure that we weren't kidnapping his guest artist. But I've been very fortunate in meeting and in many cases befriending the people who have meant the most to me artistically in my life.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. You were an early contributor to the 1970s fanzine movement, periodicals made by and for genre enthusiasts. Still, you have some problems with the term fan. Care to elaborate?
I'm just a lover of film history and those who made it. But the term fan has acquired an ugly connotation over the years. It's looked upon as someone passive sitting in their parents' basement, just watching films on TV and never doing anything with their lives. There's also the description of a fan as someone who was a stalker, who stalks his heroes. I regard myself as a more serious student of film and hopefully a professional. I am a fan. I've loved film and television since the age of 4. But there's something about that term, I don't know. It just kind of rubs me the wrong way. No one loves movies more than I do. My girlfriend is always chastising me about, are we going to see nothing but movies all month? Can't we do something else? But my whole life has been the love and adoration of motion pictures. But I don't know. It's sunk. Maybe it's snobbish on my part. Um, but again, fans. The word fan has acquired something of an unsavory reputation.
Do you have a better alternative that you like to use instead?
Yeah, I'm a writer. I've been writing. I'm almost 80. I've been writing something or other since I was 7 years old. I used to go to the Saturday matinees when I was a kid, and long before the advent of videotape and DVDs and Blu-rays, I wanted to take home something of my memory of the film. So each week when I would come back from the Saturday matinee, I had a journal, and while it was still in my thoughts, I'd write down the entire plot of the film and save it.
There's an unfinished documentary about you, The Man Who Saved the Movies. What can you tell us about that?
Somewhere around 2012, I was visited by a local writer in Philadelphia with aspirations of becoming a documentary filmmaker by the name of Craig Ellis Jameson. And Craig came over to my apartment, spent about 5 hours looking at all the pictures on my walls and the collection of letters and autographs from the likes of Sinatra, John Wayne, Hitchcock, and said he went home and called his agent in Los Angeles and said, I think I'd like to make a feature-length documentary about this gentleman. So he talked to me about it, and I told him right off the bat that I wasn't interested, that he was out of his cotton-picking mind. No one ever heard of me. No one cares. It took him literally about 3 months to convince me to go along with it and support the project. He made a theatrical trailer, a 2-minute trailer, and he called the film The Man Who Saved, with quotations, as in save the memories, the man who saved the movies. I caught a lot of flack from fans about that, as though I were the savior of the motion picture industry, which there's no stretch of the imagination would I consider myself that. But he thought it was an interesting title because I'd saved the memories of the people I've met over the years and befriended, and how I've been influenced and affected by the movies. So we shot in Los Angeles, in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia. We had, among others, Veronica Carlson, who co-starred with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, among others, in some Hammer films. Veronica became a very, very close friend of mine. I adored her. I was heartbroken when she passed on much too early, but I asked her with some trepidation, would you consider being interviewed for the documentary? And she said, of course, she'd love to, and spent about a half an hour talking about working with Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, the British film industry, and her friendship with me. We also had Juliette Roja, the daughter of Oscar-winning composer Miklos Roja, talking about film music, about my relationship with her father. We had an Emmy-winning composer, Lee Holdridge, who wrote the music for the old Beauty and the Beast TV series on CBS with Ron Perlman. And he won an Emmy for writing the music for the television remake of John Steinbeck's East of Eden, along with Mark McKenzie, who's a wonderful composer, Pat Russ, who has many film credits as an orchestrator, and Greg Nestor, who's a classical guitarist. We also had Philippe Mora, who was an acclaimed Australian filmmaker, and my buddy Paul Clemens, who starred in a 1981 horror film called The Beast Within.
You've written extensively on great symphonic film composers like Bernard Herrmann and Miklos Roja. What got you into exploring film music specifically?
Well, again, it goes back to my mother listening to the classical radio station throughout the 1950s and 60s when I lived at home, and I've developed an appreciation for symphonic music. Being a cinephile, I began listening to the music in motion pictures, and it suddenly occurred to me that I was humming the themes, remembering them. Both Erwin and I, to this day, can hum themes from most of the motion pictures that we loved going back all those years. But it struck me that the music was underappreciated, that people in the classical music field kind of looked upon film music as something of a bastard stepchild. And so I wanted to champion film music, which I regard as the classical music of the 20th century. And after John Williams began his recording career in motion pictures in the 60s, but attaining prominence in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s with the music for Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Jaws, E.T., Superman, Raiders of the Lost Ark, now performed legitimately by symphonic and classical orchestras all over the world. So I kind of regard myself as a pioneer in that regard, in that I saw early on the beauty and importance of motion picture music. I remember there was a story I believe in the 1960s. There was a classical radio station in New York City where a grouping of classical music critics would hear a piece of music and then comment on it. And they played a piece by Miklos Rozsa. And the critics were sitting there marveling about how beautiful and gorgeous the music was, but not having any idea of who composed it. At the end of the discussion, they were told it was Miklos Rozsa. Suddenly the tone changed entirely. They sneered and said, "Oh, the film guy." I resented that. I still do. I think Bernard Herrmann, Miklos Rozsa, Alfred Newman, John Williams, Alfred Newman, Eric Wolfgang Korngold, Dmitri Tiomkin, Hugo Friedhofer, and on and on and on, Jerry Goldsmith, have written, not to repeat myself, but much of the most exquisite symphonic music of the last century and into the 21st century. I've got thousands and thousands of soundtracks in my collection. I used to write a soundtrack column every month for Cinemacabre magazine. And I don't know how much time you guys have left, but I'll tell you a quick story about Jerry Goldsmith. I wanted to write an article about Jerry for my soundtrack column in Cinemacabre. This would have been around 1981. So I did my due diligence and homework and tracked down his representative in Los Angeles. So I called them, identifying myself as a writer, and that I wanted to do an article about Jerry. And was there any way I could get a hold of some stills with which to illustrate my article? So the gentleman on the other end of the phone said, "Well, I don't have any, but let me give you Jerry's phone number." So I thought, okay, you're giving me Jerry Goldsmith's phone number. I'll bite. So he gave it to me, and I assumed it was another publicist or agent. So I remember calling one night in the evening, and a woman with a Latino accent answered the phone and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Goldsmith are out to dinner. Can I take a message?" So she sounded like a housekeeper. So I explained who I was. My name is Steve Vertlieb. I'm writing an article about Mr. Goldsmith, and I wanted some photographic material to illustrate the piece. So I left my phone number, expecting nothing further to happen. The next morning, I recall it was on a Saturday morning, I was sitting in a chair reading something. The telephone rang, a very deep voice on the other end of the phone asked to speak with Steve Vertlieb. I said, "This is Steve." And he said, "This is Jerry Goldsmith returning your phone call." So I clutched my heart and went, "Oh!" I was at a loss for words, very nervous, but he was a gentleman and very kind. And he told me, he said, "Look, I don't have any stills at the moment, but I just did a new photo shoot. If you can wait a month, I'll be happy to send them to you." And I said, I'll wait." So I waited, and he was true to his word. He sent me some lovely stills, which we used in the article in Cinemacabre, and we published the article. I sent it to Jerry, and a couple of weeks later, I had a lovely letter from him thanking me for my um, supposed insight into the art of motion picture music, and he appreciated what I'd done. So that meant a lot to me, and I still have that letter. It's one of my favorite letters of all time. But I have a special place in my heart for music for the movies. I've written about it for decades and continue to do so. I have a major problem with music being written today for motion pictures because melodic themes seem to be out of favor in the film industry. It's now a lot of loud noise, music going nowhere. And John Williams is a dinosaur. He's the only guy left. I shouldn't say that. He and composers like James Newton Howard, Bruce Broughton, uh, are among the few who are still writing melodic music, but having an affection for melody and classical music, I appreciate when music goes somewhere, where it has a direction, where there are motifs, thematic scoring for characters, for themes. That seems to be out of favor in Hollywood today. I've been told by people in the industry, it's regarded as old-fashioned. And yet, in spite of that, John Williams is regarded as a god and perhaps the greatest composer of music for film in the history of the medium. So go figure that out.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because when Korngold and Max Steiner, who scored King Kong, and their colleagues were getting into Hollywood film music in the 30s and 40s, the classical world had moved away from melody, and this was one of the places where melodic symphonic music was still a thing. And now you're saying that Hollywood itself is turning against melodic music.
They were popular in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but somewhere around the mid 60s and into the early 70s, it grew out of fashion until Steven Spielberg did a little thing called Jaws, and Irwin Allen did Poseidon Adventure and The Towering Inferno, and then came Close Encounters, and suddenly movie music was back. But in recent years, certainly in over the past decade or so, it's regarded as old-fashioned. My friend Lee Holdridge, who's a marvelous composer and a very sweet man, he was in the documentary that never got completed about my life and career. A couple of years ago, Lee and I had lunch out in L.A., and I asked naively, "How's the music business?" And he looked at me ironically and said with a tinge of bitterness, "What music business?" Um, so I don't get it. I suspect that part of it is jealousy. I know Hitchcock in his later years began to resent Bernard Herrmann because Herrmann was as known as Hitchcock was for the music in his films, and I think there was a kind of jealousy and resentment going on there. But when you listen to the music, I mean, it is glorious. Roge's score for Ben-Hur is absolutely magnificent. Bernard Herrmann's scores for The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, Vertigo, Obsession for Brian De Palma, North by Northwest again for Hitchcock. The music is just absolutely glorious. magnificent and exquisite, and they're positively rapturous. You cannot deny the beauty and contribution of this music and its wonderful composers.
You became a member of the Rondo Award's Monster Kid Hall of Fame. For the uninitiated, what are the Rondos, and what was it like receiving that honor?
Well, it was one of the most exciting nights of my life. David Colton, who was until a couple of years ago the editor-in-chief of USA Today, is also a horror fan, a monster fan. And about 15, 20 years ago, he developed something called the Classic Horror Film Board. And it's basically a forum divided into many genres of horror, sci-fi, fantasy, and people write in and add their contributions and talk about the classic horror films. Early on, David developed an award for singular contributions to the genre for journalistic excellence. And he developed what's called the Rondo Award, named after Rondo Hatton, who was a horror character actor in the 1940s. He wanted to call it the Karloff, Lugosi, or Cheney Awards, but copyright infringement prevented him from doing that. So he named it after Rondo Hatton. But people like many of my heroes, like Ray Harryhausen, Ray Bradbury, Robert Bloch, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, have all been awarded the Rondo Hall of Fame Award. That's the ultimate, it's the Oscar of the Rondos. There are other awards for books, magazine articles, but the Rondo Award is the epitome. And in 2016, I was awarded that Lifetime Achievement Award. I took my girlfriend, who had never flown before, she was terrified, with me to Louisville, Kentucky to accept the award. My brother flew in from LA. One rather sad story. I knew a dear friend, Jim Burns, but Jim lobbied for years to get me the award. The night that the nominations were being announced, Jim telephoned me and said, "Are you going to wait up and hear the nominations?" And I said, "No, I'm going to bed. I've got to get up early for work." And he said, "How can you do that? You might get a nomination or get singled out for the Rondo Hall of Fame." And I said, "Jim, you're a dreamer. That's never going to happen. I'll tell you what, if that happens, I'll leave my phone on the hook, even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You can call me up, wake me up, and tell me." So consequently, 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone rings. Jim Burns is on the other end of the phone. He says, "You're in. You've won the Rondo for the Hall of Fame." And I damn near had a stroke. I couldn't believe it. I was pinching myself, which was painful, but I did it anyway, and it was wonderful. Sadly, when I arrived in Louisville, Kentucky, I was walking through the hallway of the hotel. David Colton approached me and said, "Did you hear about Jim Burns?" And I said, "No, what?" And he said, "Jim died a couple of days ago of cancer." I was devastated and heartbroken. Jim and I used to talk into the wee small hours, and I felt that Jim was largely responsible for lobbying for me to win the award. When I was the very last recipient that night in Louisville, and when I made my acceptance speech, I started talking about Jimmy, and I burst into tears. It took me a moment to recover and finish my acceptance speech. But Jimmy, if you're hearing me, I love you, I miss you, and I'll always thank you for helping to get me that Lifetime Achievement Trophy, which hangs on my living room wall.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been an honor. And I thank you so much for considering me an amusing Jew, which no one else in my world does. But thank you so much. You take care, guys.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.